The astrological energy of July is like an extreme version of a bell curve, where at the beginning of the month it was rather calm. We hit a maximum peak intensity, a big spike, right in the middle of the month during the Mars Uranus conjunction, which is still ongoing during this upcoming full moon. This had so many implications for Donald Trump. It hit a sensitive point in his chart. I talked about that in the last video. We'll repeat some of that here today. And then the intensity continues as we go to this Capricorn full moon, which is happening right next to Pluto, which is archetypally known as the god of hell in astrology. Doesn't sound like a welcoming presence. And to be fair, this will be a rather intense full moon. But everything in astrology, even the more challenging events, still represents a positive evolutionary intention. No exceptions. So we'll be talking strategically. We'll look at some of the pitfalls inherent in this structure, but we'll ask ourselves, okay, how can I proactively be working with this event for my own betterment and evolution? My name is Bryan Colter. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, and it's my privilege to discuss the energy of July. Before we get to that, though, real quick announcement. I'm starting a summer sale, 20% off a birth chart reading with me. The birth chart is an amazing lifelong companion because it speaks to areas of your life that your soul had intended to grow through the most, and then also energy that your soul intended to work with in this lifetime. It's like, for example, let's say you're a Libra. Well, okay, this is what Libra looks like. This is what it feels like. These are some of the strengths of Libra. These are some of the blinders. But how can I become an even better Libra? And we'll look at your moon side and your rising, etc. Your birth chart's a rather deep well, but I call the birth chart a template of your growth potential. So I don't do sales very often, but I'm happy to have this available for you. I'll put a link above if you're interested. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the chart. As you can see here, we have this full moon in Capricorn right next to Pluto. We also have the ongoing Mars-Uranus conjunction, which is beyond its maximum spike, which happened more July 15th and 16th. So we're beyond that point. But during this full moon, which by the way occurs on the 21st, the early morning of the 21st, it will still be ongoing, but will begin to peter out the days after. And about 2 or 3 days after this full moon, the last week of July effectively, we'll see the opposite side of the bell curve, where the last week of the month will be more calm, tranquil waters. And then lastly, we'll also want to address that Uranus is in a very tight square to Mercury here during the full moon event. Let's start with the Mars-Uranus conjunction because it's easily the biggest event of July. And I talked about this a lot in the last video, but let's just revisit some core themes. And what is the energetic texture of this event? Mars, archetypally known as the war god, is currently holding hands with Uranus, the god of earthquakes and lightning bolts. So Mars feels fiery. It's a triggering planet. It's dynamic. It's active, sometimes aggressive, sometimes violent. And Uranus is electric. It's shocking. It's stimulating. It's urgent. It's expect the unexpected. These are the energies here. So you have fire on one hand and lightning on the other. The imagery that comes to mind is like ball lightning or a lightning storm that occurs around a volcano, something like that. And Mars is the most triggering of all the planets. So when it hits a planet in the sky through a conjunction or even a square or an opposition, it will often trigger the archetypal field of potentials of that planet. And in this case, this is very much kind of feels like throwing a lit match into the pile of fireworks and kaboom, it's sudden, or throwing a flashbang into the room and it blinds us with surprise and uncertainty. Now, in regards to Donald Trump, this event happened right on his midheaven, the most visible place in his chart. The midheaven is the placement of fame, of community, of mission, the larger calling of destiny, and career. So here we have the flashbang hitting the most visible point of his chart, the very top of his chart. And I said some things about this in the last video. I'll play a real quick clip. And the Mars-Uranus conjunction is happening right on the midheaven of Donald Trump's chart. So I don't know what's going to happen. And you can't really predict with Uranus itself because it is the planet of unpredictability. But something big is going to happen. I feel that. And the outcome is going to be that more disruptive, chaotic energy. You really can't make this stuff up. Astrology can be very literal sometimes. Uranus, the planet of sudden, Mars, the planet of violence. These are two possibilities for these archetypal fields. Here they were coming together on his midheaven. There it was. The shock, the surprise. Wow. Now, Mars and Uranus is actually impacting Joe Biden's chart as well, because Uranus is in a direct opposition to his Scorpio sun in his chart. Mars has now moved on to Gemini, as you can see here on the graphic, and has formed a conjunction with Joe Biden's birth chart Uranus. So a lot of Mars-Uranus interactions in his chart. Meanwhile, it's opposing his sun. I wouldn't be surprised if during or even before the full moon, something shocking or surprising happened with Joe. Perhaps he steps down. That wouldn't be so surprising to me, but it will be for some folks. So it's really impacting the charts of both the presidential candidates, and it will be interesting to see what happens. In terms of how to work with this energy on a personal level, it's important to not really feed into the explosiveness of this event, rather practice restraint, recognizing the fireworks are going off in the world. And meanwhile, we haven't talked about the moon Pluto yet, but this is intensifying this energy even more. And to just try to enter into this state of calm equilibrium and a place of not becoming overly reactive to that, what you see outside of you. And this goes beyond the US, obviously. I apologize, I'm American. Much of my audience is American. But, you know, the Mars-Uranus conjunction is affecting the whole globe. I know that there's some riots happening in the UK right now. There's still tension brewing in France, as far as I know. Meanwhile, we got two major wars going on in the world. You know, that's going to be pretty tense during this full moon as well. So this is affecting the collective as a whole. And what I'll be doing is my best to not take the bait of falling into that really more destructive side of Mars and Uranus, but rather practicing the restraint, observing reality for how it is, and if needed, taking action, because that's part of Mars, and perhaps even speaking up if need to, because it's in the sign of communication, the sign of Gemini, with a very natural authenticity and individuation. This is the more Uranus side, to express myself as authentically as I can without the more destructive elements of the Mars-Uranus conjunction. This is a healthier response to this energy. Now let's tie in this full moon conjunct Pluto. Full moons, I've said it many times on this channel, always turn up the volume on the capacity for the collective to feel. Because the moon represents heart. It represents our subjective reality and our emotions. And when the moon is strongest is when it's a full moon in that lunar phase. So people who are feeling more strongly, okay, in general, I'm generalizing here, obviously, and when they're feeling more strongly, meanwhile, you have the uncertainty and the confusion and the unexpected of the Mars-Uranus happening at the same time. If people take that more ball lightning bait, if you will, and they're feeling more strongly in their own heart, you know, a response to working with one's moon is reflexive behavior, emotional reaction, that sort of thing. So feeling is at peak now. The volume of heart of the collective turned up to maximum now, especially with it next to Pluto, because I introduced Pluto archetypally as the god of hell, and we're using metaphor version of hell here as a hell for our unconscious mind, our subconscious mind, where we bury all our hurts, our traumas. When there's a big Pluto triggering event, and the full moon hitting it certainly qualifies, above average, people will be reacting more from, let's say, their pain body, all their repressed and suppressed emotions, which are triggered by the shocking influence of the Mars-Uranus conjunction, those triggers, that pain body, okay, that wounded inner child, if you will in some people, again, above average, come out in full battle dress now. And this event, the people that it will affect the most are the people who have in their own personal charts their sun, moon, or ascendant, but especially the moon, because we're talking about emotions here. But sun, moon, and rising sign at the early degrees of fixed signs or the later degrees of cardinal signs will be impacted by this Pluto full moon event, and they're more vulnerable to what I'm talking about here. And again, I would say restraint would be the recommendation here. And it's important to point out, as shocking as some of those events have been and will continue to be during this full moon, we definitely want to consider Pluto's placement in the early degrees of Aquarius, which it initially entered back in 2023. And Pluto spends a long time in each sign. So for the next 2 decades, Pluto will be in the sign highlighting the extreme positives and the extreme negatives of this symbol of Aquarius. And Aquarius is the sign of technology, so we'll see the extreme dark and the extreme high end of the potential of technology over the next couple decades. But what I want to focus on here, no matter how shocking the events may be this month, it's important to realize that the general momentum with the Pluto in Aquarius is pushing us towards, yes, the extreme negative, but also the extreme positive of Aquarius, which is the rebel, the revolutionary, the symbol of freedom and liberation. So no matter how we perceive the shock and awe campaign of July, recognize, as we perceive that as negative or positive or somewhere in between, it functions as a catalytic event pushing us towards more what? More Aquarius, more freedom and liberation, even if it doesn't appear that way at first glance. In terms of, over the next couple decades, the extreme negative of Aquarius being felt in the collective, we can also look at the more dark, destructive side of the rebellion, which can lead to, it makes me think of the end of V for Vendetta, exploding buildings and stuff like this. So there's definitely a very destructive side of Aquarius, and not every rebellious idea is a good one. But both are true simultaneously. And I believe by the end of this, 2 decades that Pluto's in the sign, we will feel much more free and liberated than we do today, which is a positive thing. But there's going to be some bumps along the way. I would consider to be July a pretty big bump. The month of July, with this Mars-Uranus conjunction, as we experience the intense Pluto full moon, feels like sitting on a powder keg. Now, will the powder keg explode? Probably not. But we're still sitting on the powder keg, which is quite disconcerting, to say the least. So I've said restraint a few times, we could repeat it here. But I just want to point out that there's many cultures in the world that are feeling peak division, okay, especially in America, but other countries as well, where there's just this stark juxtaposition between points of view. And on the extreme end of each polarity, there can be hatred fostered in the hearts and minds of these people, again, on the more extreme end of things. So much so, they could perceive the opposition, in some cases, as inhuman, which is very, very dangerous, especially during, this category of event. It actually makes me think of, just as a corollary here, the time of Jesus in Jerusalem, when the Sanhedrin hated the Romans so much, and probably vice versa as well. And Jesus felt much sadness and grief about this great division, because he saw in the future, about 60 or 70 years in the future, that Jerusalem would be completely destroyed because of this division. And that's part of the reason Jesus was crucified, because the Sanhedrin looked at Jesus and said, "How dare you teach us to look at Romans as fellow brothers and sisters, to see them as equal, to love them as we love ourselves?" So they, we all know the story, but, so there's that great divide. Now, I'm not predicting the destruction of the U.S. like Jerusalem, but what I am saying is there's a strong corollary here. And the teachings of Jesus, I'm not trying to get preachy here, but, love God with all your heart and love others as you love yourself. We're all brothers and sisters here. We're all souls incarnate in human bodies. We all come from the same place. We're all extensions of the divine. And sometimes people can forget that, and it can lead to great destruction. So this is a perfect time for, yes, restraint, but also soul searching and developing more awareness about our own traumas within. Now, we can have an emotional response to external stimulus, and we can be a victim in a certain situation, for example, and that can be quite painful. I mean, experiencing emotion is part of the human experience. But sometimes there can be a triggering event out there in the world, and we can have a stronger response than is really necessary in that moment. There's our pain body, which has been fueled by, a very, let's say, dramatic history of pain and suffering. So there's that old archaic wound, sometimes karmic in some circumstances, coming out, being triggered by that external stimulus more strongly than maybe is necessary in that moment. And it's quite damaging to our psyche, to our nervous system, to our energy body, to our emotions, to our thoughts, if it's allowed expression over and over in the course of our lifetime. So using an example like through the lens of evolutionary astrology, it's like, well, how do I actually work with this? Again, moon is about heart. And fundamentally, since it's the great mother archetype, it's about healing and healing emotions. And Pluto represents just all the stinkers of life, all that stuff we feel at the core of our being, all that inner trauma stuff. And then Pluto, some of those wounds will rise to the surface again if these planets are triggering a sensitive part in your own chart. And ideally, if that happens, let's say I get triggered, right, really strongly during this event, a good strategy that I'm going to employ is to just separate myself a little bit from the situation and to just breathe and to just feel to heal. And instead of feeding that pain body with, my mind, my thoughts, replaying the event in my mind, feeling justified in my expression of this emotion, I'm just going to feel it to heal with presence and love. And within some minutes, the emotion will pass. It will return to the subconscious mind, a little bit weaker next time because I didn't give it the sustenance it needed, which is my attention. We are major manifestors. Where our attention goes, energy flows. And if we really focus on those emotions and feel them and say, oh, I'm justified in this emotion and feed it thoughts, feed it our attention, and we strengthen that emotion, we strengthen the pain body within. So during a Pluto moon contact, we're presented with a precious opportunity to do, psychotherapy, so to speak. And actually, if you're doing therapy, that's great, especially during this time. Or if you're considering about doing therapy, now's a good time to start. Now, there's different forms of doing therapy. It can just be deep, revealing, emotionally and psychologically vulnerable conversations with those you love. It can be doing hypnotherapy. It can be doing meditation and deep inner work. Some of those mystical paths are ferocious, because it really is, many of these schools will focus on working with the traumatized self before we do any of these more exotic meditations. So, and actually on that note, I just released a new meditation on my other channel called Meditation Nexus, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important meditations anybody can do daily. I know that sounds a little dogmatic, but I really feel this sincerely. And it is a meditation that focuses on healing the subconscious and protecting the subconscious, which is Pluto's domain. So I'll put a link above to that meditation if you're interested. I highly recommend it. Now, lastly, we have this Uranus-Mercury square. Now, squares are hard. They're not bad, but they are challenging. So the energy of Uranus is at cross purposes with the energy of Mercury, and they're kind of a thorn in each other's side, and they're triggering each other in more problematic or challenging ways. And Uranus, we've already talked a little bit about that, the shock, the surprise, but also the evolutionary intention to individuate. That's part of Uranus. But Mercury represents our intelligence. It represents the quick thinking mind. It represents how we speak, how we think, and even how we perceive reality. So now we add the Uranian electricity to the collective mind. And this can create a lot of erratic communication. It can create a general restlessness in the energy body of the collective, and then also a lot of nervous tension in the psyche of the collective. So that's some of the challenges of this, especially through the square. But then also on a deeper level, and this is more the perspective of evolutionary astrology, Mercury represents how we perceive reality. So imagine you wake up in the morning and you're kind of sleepy and you stumble into the bathroom and you look into the mirror and all of a sudden you realize your skin is a different color, or you're 6 inches taller than you were yesterday. And here's the data before your eyes. You can see it. It's plain to see, but it's shocking to you because it's completely different than how you perceive reality over the course of your life. So these shocks in perception, the psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, is a hallmark of Mercury-Uranus interactions, especially through the square. Imagine you're a 30-year-old male who has a full head of hair, not my issue, but a full head of hair, and all of a sudden notices a bald spot on the top of the head. It's like, oh, this changes everything, And that's actually one I've struggled with. It's unfortunate that my hairline is afraid of my eyeballs, but hey, it is what it is. So the purpose of this event, and I do think the cognitive dissonance will be at peak during this full moon for the collective. But if you have one of these experiences in your own personal life, what's trying to happen is the catalyst for a shift, albeit a Uranian sudden shift, but a shift in how you perceive reality to be more in alignment with how reality actually is, so that you can individuate, there's that Uranian word, individuate your thoughts, your intelligence, and how you perceive reality in a way that's more in alignment, yes, with reality, but goes against the grain of the person you were trained to be by culture and family and the environment you were born into. So as promised, these set of energies are rather intense. It does feel like a bit of a powder keg. We can definitely see the negatives of how this can manifest, but then also the positives. So as long as we practice restraint, we go within, we seek to transform the inner pain body into love and light, because that's the most positive expression of a big Pluto event. A good evolutionary question to ask yourself is, regardless of what happens in my external reality and how that makes me feel on the internal, how can I take this experience and go through this process of transmutation and transform into a better version of myself? This is one of the most powerful ways of working with this energy. And in so doing, if successfully navigated, not only do you perceive reality more clearly, but you can walk forward in life as a more individuated expression of self. These are the core evolutionary intentions, with the goal being to expand our consciousness. Thank you for joining me.